Commonly believed to be one of the two worst decks in the Origin set, Lady of Luminosity has garnered some recent attention thanks to an almost top 200 placement at China's first National Open. This is in large part due to some rather interesting tech that's been discovered for Kaisa and Master Yi respectively. By no means does this result prove any sort of viability when it comes to Lux potentially topping events, but it has shown that control decks are a valid archetype in Riftbound, and Lux may be a more legitimate prototype than she seems. I'm Rose with 4 Hearts, and today we're going to break down how to play Lady of Luminosity in the Origins format. Lady of Luminosity is a mind and order legend with an ability that allows the player to draw a card every time they use a spell that costs 5 or more energy. This domain combination results in a much more reactive style of play compared to most of the meta. With a legend ability that can't be activated until turn 2 at the earliest, Lux is forced to be much more patient in how she plays. This naturally results in control being the niche best suited for her. With most of the viable spells that cost 5 or more in the mind and order domains being unit damaging or killing spells, this legend prefers to wait until opponents set up big units before striking. We'll be taking a look at the general strategies for both Lux Crownguard and Lux Illuminated for this breakdown, so you can get a feel for how each likes to build around the Lady of Luminosity legend. For Lux Crownguard, we'll be looking at a more traditional control build that makes full use of large spells, and for Lux Illuminated, we'll be exploring a combat build that leans into mind and order's available combat tricks. The main appeal for the Lux Crownguard build is how easily it takes out big units. With cards like Cold the Weak, Blast of Power, and Singularity, among a few others, this deck can take out at least one sizable unit per turn once you reach the mid-game. This makes it really difficult for opponents to set up boards that they can feel confident in, as they'll be forced to play with their smaller units. Most of these spells will also draw you an extra card, which will often be another removal spell, allowing you to repeat the cycle. With a fair amount of the cards in your build being included for unit removal, having a sizable hand and rune count can sometimes be more threatening than the cards themselves. This deck generally has access to a wide variety of control options for offensive and defensive purposes. Between unit removal and cards like Recruit the Vanguard and Facebreaker to defend your holds, this build can consistently take and hold one battlefield for much of the game. And finally, due to Lux Crownguard, Echo Recurrent, and the scaling nature of this list, this is the only deck in this set that can reasonably achieve turns where more than 12 energy are spent. A major issue for Lux's style of control is that it can often struggle to get past more than one significant unit in a turn. Individually, the control spells in this deck are highly consistent in removing large units, but because they're so expensive, it's incredibly exhausting trying to remove more than one problematic unit in a turn, especially if you still have your own units to play or a battlefield to protect. This then makes it incredibly difficult to convert defense to offense, which is a massive problem for a control deck. Ideally, you're able to wipe an opponent's board and still have room to conquer the newly open battlefields for a cheap cost, but with the only accelerate options for Lux being Echo Recurrent, Thousand-Tailed Watcher, and Darius Executioner, your cheapest method of conquering is already having units in base. This sole style of play results in the glaring lack of proactivity that forces you to always play with the next 2 to 3 turns in mind, as you can't afford to waste spells. Most turns will boil down to whether or not you're playing units, playing spells, or saving spells to hold a battlefield you already control, as doing more than one won't be feasible for most of the game. The high cost of spells, slow tempo, and lack of proactivity all result in a build that has very few combos that it can successfully pull off. Individually, there are many high value cards in this deck, but when opponents don't have to worry about more than 2 cards being played in the turn, and they're looking at a board state with very few units, it's not that hard for them to find ways to play around your spells. Similar to Lux Crownguard, the Lux Illuminated build specializes in removing big units through a variety of control options that are well suited for offense and defense. The biggest change with this list is that it has access to a wider variety of combos due to leaning into a much more aggressive early game, albeit a much riskier early game. With cards like Stupefy, Facebreaker, Shenkinku, and Back to Back, this deck utilizes combat tricks in the early game to match tempo before switching into control in the late game. This aggressive early game allows Lux to play more similarly to Nine-Tailed Fox or Wuju Blazeman's tempo builds, and can find decent success in doing so. The main issue is that unlike those decks that rely on cheap spells and big units, Lux relies on cheap units with big spells. The back-end cost of these spells makes it much more difficult to defend units against big pushes, but is better at preventing combat altogether thanks to removal spells. This balanced approach to combat can both help and hinder Lux's ability to control. While this build is stronger in combat compared to Lux Crownguard, the drop-off in control cards can make it even more difficult to clear both battlefields in one turn. This deck needs to establish tempo and retain it the entire game, or it will struggle to catch back up in the late game. And finally, also because of the weak units, this list is fairly easy to outbuild when it comes to setting up strong boards. The big spells and combat tricks in hand can pay off well in the right circumstances, but on paper, this deck doesn't always have the firepower needed to win games. The first step for Lux Crownguard is to utilize 2 drops in your first couple of turns to match your opponent's tempo. Just because you're playing control doesn't mean you should forfeit free points in the early game. Next, you'll want to play Lux Crownguard in base, ideally on your second turn. Playing Lux as early as possible is vital for getting the most value out of her ability. Even if you're going to lose tempo for doing it, her ability is the most consistent way to catch back up in the mid and late game. However, there are a few matchups where you should be a bit more cautious on when you play Lux, as you're only running one. Fury matchups in particular are tricky due to Falling Star. With Lux in base, you should play Stupefy to increase your hand size for later in the game. Ideally, you'll play this when smaller units like Daring Poro and Ravenbloom Student are in combat to maintain the battlefield, but it's also fine to just use it for the draw. Lastly, you want to play Faithful Manufactor to start setting up some tokens. Moving into the mid game, this is where the build truly starts to come online a bit. At this point in the game, all of your big spells will be available to play, as you should never cycled any runes in the early game, so the biggest priority here is pushing your opponent off of battlefields when it makes sense to do so. Even if you're unsuccessful, draining as many of their resources as possible before the late game is imperative. In addition to battlefield control, you want to minimize the size of their base with cards like Hold the Weak and Singularity. While dwindling your opponent's board, if everything is going well, you should have some extra runes available to start setting up more tokens with Recruit the Vanguard. During games where you're playing with the Grand Plaza, the timing of this step can be crucial. Then, if you think you have a good time warp angle, you should try and score up until 4 to 5 points and then leave both battlefields. This will allow you to lean into a full control mode until you're ready to win the game with time warp. For the final turns of the game, you'll want to add any final units you can to your board before going in for a final push. You also need to keep your opponent off of at least one battlefield. Lux generally doesn't like to play into more than one battlefield as there are too many variables that are difficult for a control deck to account for in late game scenarios. You should also be keeping as many runes open as possible. You're looking to play an all-out defense until you're confident you can take the game with one final turn. Even if you have more resources available than your opponent, most decks can get way more value out of a few runes than Lux can. And finally, once your opponent has exhausted their resources, move into the empty battlefields for a final push. This will ideally be done with time warp, but if you've secured enough of an advantage, you won't always need it. Lux Illuminated flips the general Lady of Luminosity strategy on its head, as the early game is far and away the most important part of the game. The first step for this build is to score early points with your 2 drops to establish tempo. With this tempo, you want to play Ravenbloom Student to base while your opponent deals with whatever 2 drop you already have at a battlefield. Or, if you went first and started with Ravenbloom Student on turn 1, then moving into a battlefield with Shenkunku and Stupefy in hand can be a really strong turn 2 combo. Whether your Ravenbloom Student is in base or already on a battlefield, you want to stock up protected spells to keep your potential hold alive for as long as possible. And finally, just keep holding with Ravenbloom Student for as long as it makes sense to do so. The idea here is to force your opponent to waste energy on Ravenbloom Student so they have a harder time dealing with Lux Illuminated and big control spells in the late game. Moving into the mid game, ideally you can continue holding, but it won't be nearly as feasible as it was in the early game. So don't be afraid to back off a bit here, especially if it won't sacrifice your lead. You'll be starting the transition into your control mode here and should look to start countering problematic units with your big spells. Off the back of these spells, and when the window reveals itself, you'll look to play Lux Illuminated during a turn where your opponent's board has been cleared. With Lux Illuminated being a 6 energy, 1 power cost unit, this window is extremely tight. And finally, set up some tokens when you can and use them to sneak in extra points after clearing your opponent's units. Similar to the first build, Lux Illuminated wants to force the game into a 1 battlefield state in the late game. To achieve this, they'll use spells to secure a unit advantage and potentially a might advantage if all goes optimally. Then you can move back into a battlefield you think you can hold and potentially win from. When holding at this point in the game, you should be using your combat tricks and hidden cards to slow down your opponent. And finally, utilizing Echo Recurrence Death Knell ability can spark an immense amount of momentum. Playing a few units or a mid-range spell before accelerating Echo into a battlefield to scope it out can be a game changer, allowing you to play with almost double your rune count in one turn. As a scaling control deck, Lux Crownguard plays well into other scaling decks but struggles heavily into faster paced aggro decks, especially decks that look to play games through both battlefields. With a weak offensive line and mostly reactive spells, decks that can strain Lux's rune count and overwhelm her units have an easy time dominating the matchup, whereas decks that prefer slower tempos and don't combo as frequently are much easier to control. The best matchups for Lux Crownguard are Wuju Bladesman, Nine-Tailed Fox, Bounty Hunter, and Swift Scout. Some neutral matchups are Unforgiven, Blind Monk, Herald of the Arcane, and Daughter of the Void. And the worst matchups are Loose Cannon, Hand of Noxus, The Boss, and Darkchild. For Lux Illuminated, matchups mostly come down to battlefield tempo. Decks that have a hard time playing through combat tricks will often rely on a few key cards to break down this build's defenses, and then be susceptible to her control spells. But due to an aggressive start and slow finish, decks that can prevent Lux from taking a lead in the early game or continuously wipe her boards in the late game are difficult to play into. The best matchups for Lux Illuminated are Swift Scout, Nine-Tailed Fox, Wuju Bladesman, and Loose Cannon. Some neutral matchups are Herald of the Arcane, Bounty Hunter, Unforgiven, and Blind Monk. And the worst matchups are Hand of Noxus, The Boss, Darkchild, and Daughter of the Void. The mandatory cards for the Lux Crownguard build are Lady of Luminosity and 1 Lux Crownguard. Some cards you should definitely include are 2 to 3 Soaring Scout, 3 Faithful Manufactor, 3 Falling Comet, 2 to 3 Echo Recurrent, 2 Imperial Decree, 2 to 3 Blast of Power, 2 to 3 Singularity, 3 Recruit the Vanguard, and 2 Time Warp. Some units that can help round out your build are Ravenbloom Student and Daring Poro. Other cards that are helpful are Final Spark, Garbage Grabber, Facebreaker, and Cool the Weak. Salvage is a solid tech card for Zoning's Hourglass and Dowsing Aurora, and Unchecked Power is a good option for token decks and decks that stack up armies of units. You definitely want Aspirant's Climb and the Grand Plaza as 2 of your 3 battlefields and should slot in Viamal's Lair as a 3rd. And for runes, you should take either 6 or 7 Mind Runes and 5 or 6 Order Runes depending on your power distribution and preferred spells. The mandatory cards for the Lux Illuminated build are Lady of Luminosity and 1 Lux Illuminated. Some cards you should definitely include in your list are 3 Stupefy, 3 3 Ravenbloom Student, 3 Sorin Scout, 2-3 Facebreaker, 3 Shankinku, 2 back-to-back, 3 Falling Comet, 2-3 Echo Recurrent, 2-3 Blast of Power, 2-3 Singularity, and 3 Recruit the Vanguard. Some cards that can round out your build are Final Spark, Yarian Poro, Faithful Manufactor, and Time Warp. You definitely want Aspirant's Climb and the Grand Plaza as 2 of your 3 battlefields, and should slot in Viamol's Lair as a 3rd. And for runes, you should take either 6 or 7 Mind Runes and 5 or 6 Order Runes depending on your power distribution and preferred spells. If you're looking to play Lady of Luminosity, then here are the lists we recommend. That wraps up our Lady of Luminosity deck profile. If you found this video helpful, feel free to like and subscribe. Good luck in your games, and thanks for watching.